Hey guys, tonight we're taking a walk down Britain's most famous medieval street. Today it's filled with tourists, but a few centuries ago, this street was famous for entirely different reasons. So before you get comfortable, take a moment like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Long before the Shambles became one of Britain's most photographed streets, before tourists arrived armed with smartphones and an unshakable determination to photograph the exact same building from the exact same angle as the previous 8,000 visitors, this corner of York was already a bustling centre of trade. To understand the Shambles, we need to travel back nearly 1,000 years. At the time, York was one of the most important cities in England. The Romans had built a fortress here centuries earlier. Then came the Vikings, who captured the city and transformed it into a thriving trading hub known as Jorvik. Merchants arrived from across northern Europe carrying furs, cloth, amber, metal goods, and whatever else could survive a long sea voyage without becoming a legal dispute. York's location made it valuable. Roads connected it to the rest of England. Rivers connected it to the sea. Trade brought money. Money brought people. People brought more people. Before long, the city was growing faster than anyone had planned. Not that anyone had actually planned much. Medieval urban planning largely consisted of building something wherever there happened to be empty space, and then acting surprised when congestion appeared a few decades later. Within York's protective walls, streets became increasingly crowded. Houses pressed against workshops. Workshops pressed against shops. Shops pressed against taverns. Taverns pressed against everything else. The future Shambles occupied a particularly desirable location near the commercial heart of the city. Merchants wanted access to customers. Customers wanted access to goods. Landowners wanted access to profits. Nobody wanted access to taxes, but those arrived anyway. By the 12th century, the area had become one of the busiest parts of York. The street itself looked nothing like the charming destination visitors admire today. Instead of neat cobblestones and carefully restored timber buildings, you would have found uneven ground. Mud, livestock, carts, noise, and enough unpleasant smells to make your eyes question their commitment to remaining open. After rainfall, the road became a thick mixture of mud and whatever else happened to be lying around. And there was always something lying around. A medieval street was not cleaned by municipal services. It was cleaned by rain, gravity, pigs, and hope. Mostly hope. Yet despite the dirt and disorder, opportunity flourished here. Traders shouted from stalls. Craftsmen worked from dawn until dusk. Apprentices carried goods through crowded lanes while trying not to get kicked by horses, robbed by thieves, or yelled at by their masters. Some succeeded. Most got yelled at anyway. As York grew wealthier, the district grew with it. New buildings replaced older ones. Families established businesses that lasted generations. Money flowed through the neighbourhood. But among all the trades competing for space, one profession slowly began to dominate the street. A profession involving sharp knives, hanging carcasses, rivers of blood, and work days that would make modern health inspectors collapse on the spot. The butchers were coming, and they were about to make this street famous for all the wrong reasons. As York continued to grow, one particular trade slowly took control of the street. It was not goldsmiths. It was not merchants selling exotic spices from distant lands. It was not wealthy bankers counting coins in luxurious offices. It was butchers, and lots of them. In fact, the Shambles became so closely associated with the meat trade that its very name reflects it. The word shambles comes from the old Anglo-Saxon term fleshamels, which referred to the shelves or benches upon which butchers displayed their meat. Over centuries, the word evolved until it eventually became the Shambles. Today the name sounds charming and historic. In medieval York, it essentially meant the place where dead animals are sold. Not quite as marketable on postcards. By the 13th and 14th centuries, butcher shops lined both sides of the street. Nearly every building was connected to the trade in some way. Customers arrived daily to purchase beef, pork, mutton, and other meats. Animals were brought into the city, slaughtered, prepared, and sold with remarkable efficiency. The process was practical. It was also spectacularly unpleasant. Modern butcher shops separate customers from most of the messy details. Medieval butchers saw little reason for such theatrics. Animals were often slaughtered nearby. Carcasses hung openly from hooks. Skins, bones, organs, and scraps accumulated throughout the day. If you purchased meat here, you were fully aware that it had once been attached to a living creature only hours earlier. The street itself became an extension of the marketplace. Many butcher shops featured large open windows where meat could be displayed to passing customers. Some of the famous wooden shelves that projected from buildings can still be seen today. They once held cuts of meat rather than souvenir mugs and fantasy-themed merchandise. The smell was impossible to ignore. Fresh meat has an odour. Fresh meat sitting outside all day has a stronger odour. Fresh meat sitting outside in summer heat while surrounded by animal waste creates an experience that modern tourism boards rarely mention. Yet medieval customers considered this perfectly normal. The sight of blood was normal. The smell was normal. The constant buzz of flies was normal. What would horrify many visitors today was simply another shopping trip. The butchers prospered. Their businesses became successful. Families passed shops down through generations. But success came with consequences, because when dozens of butcher shops operated side by side, they produced far more than meat. They produced waste, and soon that waste would transform the shambles into one of the filthiest streets in medieval England. The success of York's butchers created one small problem. Actually, several large problems. The first problem was blood. The second problem was waste. The third problem was that medieval people had not yet invented the phrase environmental sanitation. Every day, animals were slaughtered, butchered, cleaned, and prepared for sale. While this supplied the city with much-needed food, it also produced mountains of unwanted remains. Bones, fat, skin, organs, scraps of meat, and gallons upon gallons of blood all had to go somewhere. Unfortunately for everyone involved, that somewhere was usually the street. The shambles was designed with a narrow channel running down its centre. Today, visitors often walk over it without giving it much thought. In the Middle Ages, this gutter served an important purpose. It carried away waste, or at least that was the theory. In practice, the gutter struggled heroically against impossible odds. Throughout the day, blood from freshly slaughtered animals flowed into the channel. Rainwater mixed with it. Animal waste joined the procession. Various unidentified substances, whose origins were probably best left uninvestigated, followed shortly afterward. The gutter did its best. The gutter often lost. On warm summer days, the smell could become overwhelming. Imagine dozens of butcher shops operating side by side in a narrow street with limited airflow. Then imagine the leftovers from those shops sitting in the heat for hours. Now imagine it without modern plumbing. Suddenly, that medieval postcard looks slightly different. Flies absolutely loved the shambles. From a fly's perspective, this was less a street and more a luxury resort. Food was everywhere. Breeding grounds were plentiful. The management imposed very few rules. Dogs also wandered through the area searching for scraps. Cats hunted rodents attracted by discarded waste. Pigs occasionally appeared to consume whatever remained. In many ways, animals formed an unofficial sanitation department. Their standards, however, were not particularly rigorous. Yet the people of York largely accepted these conditions. This was not because they enjoyed living among unpleasant smells. It was because such sights and odours were normal parts of urban life. Nobody walked through the shambles complaining that standards had fallen. There were no standards. The entire street operated according to a simple principle. If the meat was fresh enough to sell, everything else could wait until tomorrow. But waste has consequences, and over time, the filth accumulating in York's crowded streets would create conditions far more dangerous than a bad smell, because lurking behind the blood, the flies, and the overflowing gutters was an invisible enemy that medieval people barely understood. Disease. The smells of the shambles were unpleasant. The filth was unpleasant. The rivers of animal blood were unpleasant. But none of those things represented the greatest danger. The greatest danger was something medieval people could not see. Disease. Modern visitors often imagine medieval illnesses arriving dramatically from distant lands, carried by mysterious travellers or invading armies. Sometimes that happened. More often, however, disease simply grew quietly in the environment people had created for themselves. And medieval cities were exceptionally good at creating environments where disease could thrive. York was crowded. Houses stood tightly packed together. Families often shared small rooms. Livestock lived close to humans. Waste accumulated in streets and yards. Wells could become contaminated. Water sources were not always reliable. The city was prosperous. It was also, from a modern public health perspective, an absolute nightmare. The shambles was particularly vulnerable. The butcher trade attracted customers from across the city. Animals arrived regularly. Blood and waste flowed through the gutters. Flies moved freely between refuse and food. Rats found endless opportunities. To a disease-carrying organism, the shambles was not a problem. It was a solution. People constantly became sick. Stomach illnesses were common. Fevers swept through neighborhoods. Skin infections spread easily. Cuts that seem minor today could become life-threatening. A simple infection could kill a healthy adult within days. Even routine injuries carried risks. Imagine nicking your hand while preparing dinner. Now imagine doing so before antibiotics existed. Suddenly, dinner feels considerably more exciting than intended. Medical knowledge offered limited help. Medieval doctors worked with the information available to them, but much of it was based on ancient theories rather than scientific evidence. Treatments often involved balancing bodily humours, bloodletting, herbal mixtures, or various remedies that occasionally helped and occasionally made matters worse. Sometimes the cure and the disease appeared to be competing for the same victim. Ordinary people relied on experience, local healers, religious faith, and luck. Mostly luck. Children faced especially grim odds. Many never reached adulthood. Illnesses that modern medicine treats routinely could devastate entire families. A cough, fever, or infected wound could quickly become a tragedy. Yet life continued. Merchants opened their shops. Butchers prepared meat. Customers filled the streets. People married, worked, raised children, and planned for the future, despite living in a world where sickness was a constant companion. For generations, York endured these dangers. Then, in the middle of the 14th century, a new disease arrived in England, one that would make all previous outbreaks seem almost insignificant. The Black Death was coming. In the year 1348, terrifying rumours began spreading across England. Entire towns were reporting strange illnesses. Travellers spoke of villages where people died so quickly that healthy families could be reduced to a handful of survivors within weeks. Ships arrived carrying stories of catastrophe from the continent. Merchants whispered about cities where church bells rang so often that people stopped counting the funerals. Most residents of York probably hoped the stories were exaggerated. Human beings have always been remarkably good at convincing themselves that disasters happen somewhere else. Unfortunately, the Black Death had other plans. The plague arrived in England through southern ports before steadily moving northward. As trade routes carried goods across the country, they also carried something far deadlier. By the time the disease approached York, fear had already arrived ahead of it. No one fully understood what was happening. Some believed God was punishing humanity for its sins. Others blamed unusual weather. Some pointed fingers at foreigners, strangers, or unpopular neighbours. History repeatedly demonstrates that when people cannot explain a crisis, they become surprisingly creative in assigning blame. What nobody understood was bacteria. That discovery was still centuries away. When the plague finally reached York, the results were devastating. Victims often developed painful swellings known as buboes. Fever followed. Weakness set in. Many died within days. Some deteriorated so rapidly that families who cared for them in the morning attended their funerals by the week's end. The speed terrified people. This was not a disease that lingered politely. It arrived like an invading army. The crowded conditions of medieval cities helped the plague spread. York's narrow streets, busy markets, and dense population created countless opportunities for infection. Areas like the Shambles, already struggling with sanitation and overcrowding, offered little protection. Business slowed. Trade suffered. Fear became a permanent resident. People avoided neighbours showing symptoms. Families isolated themselves when possible. Priests performed endless funerals. Graveyards filled at alarming rates. Yet daily life could not completely stop. People still needed food. The butcher shops still operated. Markets still opened. Life continued because survival required it. And perhaps that was the cruelest part of the plague. Most people could not simply hide indoors and wait for danger to pass. They had to keep working, buying, selling, and interacting with others while death moved silently through the city. By the time the first wave subsided, York had changed forever. Thousands were gone. Entire households had vanished. Businesses stood empty, and for those who survived, the memory would remain for the rest of their lives. But the plague left behind more than grief. It left behind labour shortages, economic upheaval, and a city struggling to rebuild itself in the shadow of unimaginable loss. When the worst of the Black Death finally passed through York, the city found itself facing a strange and unsettling problem. There were suddenly far fewer people. For centuries, overcrowding had been a fact of life. Families squeezed into small homes. Apprentices shared cramped rooms. Workers competed fiercely for jobs. Landlords rarely struggled to find tenants. Then the plague arrived and changed everything. Entire households disappeared. Some homes stood empty for months. Others were abandoned altogether. Shops closed because their owners had died. Workshops lost skilled craftsmen. Businesses that had survived for generations suddenly had no one left to run them. The silence must have felt almost unnatural. For the first time in living memory, certain parts of York had space. Unfortunately, the reason for that space was deeply disturbing. The survivors now lived among constant reminders of loss. Empty buildings lined familiar streets. Former neighbours were gone. Friends, relatives, customers, employers, apprentices and priests had vanished. Every street contained memories. Every market stall had a story. Every churchyard held fresh graves. Yet history has a habit of continuing whether people are ready or not. Life slowly resumed. The butcher shops of the Shambles reopened fully. Markets became busy again. Trade gradually recovered. New workers arrived to fill positions left vacant by the dead. But something important had changed. Labour had suddenly become valuable. Before the plague, employers often held the advantage. There were plenty of workers available. If one labourer demanded higher wages, another could easily replace him. Now the situation was different. Workers were scarce. A butcher who lost 3 apprentices could not simply walk outside and find 3 more. A merchant missing employees faced real difficulties. Skilled craftsmen became increasingly difficult to replace. For surviving workers, this created opportunities. Wages began to rise. Some labourers found themselves earning more money than their parents ever had. People who once struggled near the bottom of society discovered that their skills were suddenly in demand. Not everyone welcomed these changes. Many wealthy landowners and employers were horrified by the idea of workers gaining leverage. Authorities attempted to control wages and preserve the old social order. The old social order, however, had recently died in large numbers. Reality proved difficult to legislate. In York, as across much of England, the plague had unintentionally shifted the balance of power. The dead had left behind opportunities for the living, but recovery remained fragile. Disease could return, food shortages could still strike, and while the city rebuilt itself, another danger constantly haunted the people of the Shambles. Unlike plague, this threat could be seen from miles away. It usually began with a single spark. For the people who lived and worked on the Shambles, plague was terrifying. Disease was terrifying. Famine was terrifying. But there was one danger that could destroy everything you owned in a single afternoon: fire. Modern visitors often admire the street's beautiful timber-framed buildings, the dark wooden beams, the overhanging upper floors, the centuries-old craftsmanship, all wonderfully picturesque. To a medieval resident, however, those same buildings looked suspiciously flammable, and for good reason. The Shambles was essentially a narrow corridor packed with wooden structures, standing shoulder to shoulder. Many buildings shared walls. Others leaned so close together that upper floors nearly touched. Roofs were covered with combustible materials. Inside, families heated homes with open fires, cooked meals over flames, and illuminated rooms using candles and oil lamps. In other words, medieval York had accidentally created a giant wooden box filled with fire. What could possibly go wrong? Quite a lot, as it turned out. A single overturned candle could start a disaster. A cooking fire left unattended could spread rapidly. A spark from a hearth could drift into a roof and begin smouldering unnoticed. Once flames gained momentum, they moved quickly. The narrow streets that made York charming also made firefighting difficult. There were no professional fire brigades, no fire engines, no emergency response teams arriving within minutes. Instead, neighbours became the fire department. Buckets of water were passed hand to hand through the streets. Residents climbed roofs attempting to stop the spread. Entire communities fought fires together because everyone understood a simple truth: if your neighbour's house burned, yours might be next. The Shambles was particularly vulnerable. Its famous overhanging upper stories allowed flames to leap easily from one building to another. Fire did not care about property boundaries. It simply looked for more wood, and there was plenty of wood. Many residents lived with a constant awareness of this danger. Valuable possessions were kept close. Families knew that everything they owned could disappear overnight. For poorer households, a fire was more than an inconvenience. It was financial ruin. Yet, despite the risks, people continued building in the same way. Timber remained affordable. Space remained limited. Life continued. Humans have always been remarkably skilled at acknowledging danger and then carrying on anyway. The buildings of the Shambles survived countless fires over the centuries. Some were damaged. Some were rebuilt. Some escaped destruction through sheer luck. But while fire threatened the street from within, another source of fear loomed just beyond it. A fear that came not from flames or disease, but from the people who ruled the city, and the punishments they imposed upon those who broke its laws. For all its wealth and importance, medieval York was not a particularly peaceful place. This should not come as a surprise. The city contained thousands of people living in close quarters, competing for money, property, business opportunities, and social status. Add alcohol, poor lighting, sharp knives, and a legal system that was still very much a work in progress, and conflict became almost inevitable. The shambles, with its crowded shops and constant flow of customers, provided endless opportunities for crime. Pickpockets worked busy markets. Thieves targeted merchants carrying valuable goods. Scammers cheated customers whenever possible. And arguments had an unfortunate tendency to escalate very quickly. Today, a disagreement over a business transaction might result in a strongly worded online review. In medieval York, it might result in someone reaching for a knife. The city authorities attempted to maintain order, but policing looked very different from what we know today. There was no modern police force, no detectives, no forensic teams carefully analysing evidence. Instead, communities largely policed themselves. If a crime occurred, victims often relied upon witnesses, neighbours or local officials. Suspects could be pursued through a system known as the hue and cry, where ordinary citizens were expected to help chase criminals. Imagine being woken in the middle of the night and ordered to help hunt a thief through dark medieval streets. Participation was not considered optional. Justice itself could be harsh. Fines were common for minor offences. More serious crimes could result in imprisonment, public humiliation, mutilation, or execution. Medieval authorities believed punishment should serve as a warning, a very visible warning. Public punishments attracted crowds. People gathered to watch offenders placed in stocks, pillories, or other devices designed to maximise embarrassment. The public was expected to learn a lesson. The crowd often learned new insults instead. Executions were even more dramatic. They served as powerful reminders of royal authority and the consequences of breaking the law. For residents of York, these spectacles were part of life. Children grew up seeing them. Merchants discussed them. Travellers carried stories of them to other towns. The message was simple: obey the law, or become entertainment. Yet despite the threat of punishment, crime never disappeared. Where there was money, there were thieves. Where there were crowded streets, there were opportunities. And where there were human beings, there were bad decisions. The people of the shambles lived with this reality every day. But while criminals posed a danger to individuals, another threat loomed over the entire city. A threat capable of turning neighbour against neighbour. A threat fueled by fear, faith and suspicion. Religious tensions were about to cast one of the darkest shadows in York's long history. For centuries, York was one of England's most important religious cities. Towering churches dominated the skyline. Monasteries housed monks and nuns. Priests guided communities through baptisms, marriages and funerals. Pilgrims travelled long distances to visit sacred sites. Religion shaped nearly every aspect of daily life. It also had the unfortunate tendency to divide people. Most visitors strolling through the shambles today have little reason to think about religious conflict. The street feels peaceful, charming even. But in the 12th century, one of the darkest events in York's history unfolded only a short walk away. At its centre stood York's Jewish community. Jewish families had lived in England since the Norman conquest. Many settled in important cities like York, where they became merchants, traders, and moneylenders. Because Christian teachings often restricted lending money with interest, Jewish financiers filled an important economic role. They were useful, they were successful, and that success sometimes made them targets. As debts accumulated and tensions grew, resentment followed. The situation worsened during periods of political instability. Rumours spread easily, accusations multiplied, religious prejudice mixed with economic frustration in a dangerous combination. History repeatedly demonstrates that when societies face uncertainty, minorities often become convenient scapegoats. York was no exception. In the year 1190, tensions finally exploded. Violence erupted against York's Jewish population. Seeking safety, many Jewish families fled to Clifford's Tower, the royal fortress overlooking the city. There they hoped royal protection would shield them from the growing mob. Instead, they found themselves trapped. The siege continued for days. Conditions deteriorated. As the crowd outside grew increasingly hostile, the those sheltering inside faced an impossible choice. Rather than fall into the hands of the attackers, many chose death. The tragedy that followed became one of the worst anti-Jewish massacres in medieval English history. Hundreds died, families vanished, an entire community was devastated. The event shocked contemporaries and left a stain upon York's history that remains remembered centuries later. Yet life in the city continued. Markets reopened, businesses resumed. The Shambles carried on selling meat, just as it had before. That may be one of history's harshest lessons. Even after terrible events, ordinary life often returns surprisingly quickly. The buildings remain, the streets remain, the city moves forward, but the memories linger beneath the surface. And as York entered the later Middle Ages, another kind of shadow began gathering over the Shambles, not one created by hatred or violence, but by age itself. Because the very buildings that made the street famous were beginning to bend, sag, and lean in ways that would terrify modern engineers. One of the first things visitors notice about the Shambles is that the buildings seem to be falling over, not dramatically, not in a way that requires immediate evacuation, more in a way that suggests the buildings have spent the last 600 years slowly reconsidering their relationship with gravity. The leaning upper floors have become one of the street's most famous features. Tourists love them, photographers love them, historians love them. Medieval builders, however, probably would have preferred their houses to remain upright. The oldest surviving buildings on the Shambles date largely from the 14th and 15th centuries. They were constructed using timber frames filled with plaster and other materials. At the time, these structures represented practical solutions to urban living. No one expected them to survive into the 21st century. Frankly, many probably did not expect them to survive into the 16th. Yet here they are. Part of the reason the buildings lean is simple age. Timber shifts over time. Foundations settle. Generations of repairs, modifications and additions gradually altered the structures. Each century left its mark. A wall might be moved, a room expanded, a roof repaired, a floor reinforced. Then another generation would come along and make its own adjustments. After several hundred years, the result resembled less a carefully engineered structure and more a very successful architectural compromise. The famous overhanging upper stories also contributed to the effect. Property owners wanted more living space, but land inside York's walls was expensive. Rather than expanding outward at ground level, they built upper floors that projected over the street below. This approach created larger homes without requiring additional land. It also created the visual impression that the buildings were slowly attempting to shake hands above pedestrians' heads. In some places, the upper stories grew so close together that daylight struggled to reach the street below. The Shambles became darker, narrower, more enclosed, which was wonderful if you enjoyed atmosphere, less wonderful if you enjoyed sunlight. Despite their appearance, these buildings survived numerous threats. Fires damaged some structures, storms battered others, economic downturns reduced maintenance. Wars disrupted trade, yet the street endured, partly because residents continually repaired what they could, partly because replacing entire buildings was expensive, and partly because medieval people possessed a remarkable ability to look at a visibly crooked house and conclude that it would probably be fine for another generation. Most of the time, they were correct. But as the centuries passed, the aging street accumulated more than structural quirks. It accumulated stories. Strange stories. Stories of shadows, whispers, unexplained footsteps, and encounters that convinced many residents that the Shambles was not entirely occupied by the living. A street that survives for nearly 1,000 years is bound to collect stories. Some are true, some are exaggerated, some begin with a neighbour telling a tale after a few drinks, and somehow end centuries later in guidebooks and ghost tours. The Shambles has accumulated all three. York itself is often described as one of the most haunted cities in England. Whether that title is deserved or not depends largely on your opinion of ghosts. It also depends on how willing you are to walk through dark medieval streets at night, while someone enthusiastically points at shadows. The city's age certainly helps. Romans lived here, Vikings lived here, Normans lived here. Medieval merchants, priests, soldiers, criminals, and countless ordinary families lived here, and eventually all of them died here. That tends to encourage speculation. The Shambles became a natural home for ghost stories. The narrow street, leaning buildings, and centuries of history created the perfect atmosphere. During foggy evenings, the upper floors seem to close in overhead. The street grows quiet. Footsteps echo strangely between the buildings. It does not take much imagination to feel that someone might be watching, Many local legends speak of mysterious figures appearing briefly before vanishing. Shopkeepers have reported hearing footsteps in empty buildings. Others have described doors opening unexpectedly or strange noises during the night. Skeptics usually point out that ancient timber buildings make noises constantly. Floors creak, wood expands, walls settle, roofs shift. A 600-year-old building produces enough strange sounds to keep any ghost comfortably unemployed. Yet the stories persist. One reason may be the history itself. Generation after generation lived on the Shambles. Families were born here. Businesses succeeded and failed here. People laughed, argued, married, worked, suffered, and died within these buildings. The sheer number of human lives connected to the street gives it a powerful sense of presence. Even without believing in ghosts, visitors often feel something unusual, not supernatural, historical. The sensation that countless people have stood exactly where you are standing. The sensation that the street remembers, and in a way it does. Every beam, doorway, and worn stone carries evidence of centuries of use. The stories may change, the legends may grow, but the past never entirely disappears. Ironically, the greatest threat to the Shambles would not come from ghosts at all. It would come from progress, because by the 19th century, many people looked at old medieval streets and saw not history, but obstacles that needed to be removed. By the 19th century, the Shambles had survived plague, fire, economic crises, religious tensions, and centuries of wear and tear. Ironically, its greatest threat arrived during an age of prosperity. The Victorian era transformed Britain. Factories appeared across the country. Railways connected cities. New technologies changed daily life. Urban planners looked at ancient neighbourhoods with fresh eyes. Unfortunately for medieval buildings, those eyes often saw problems. To many Victorian reformers, old streets were dirty, overcrowded, unhealthy relics of a backward age. Narrow lanes blocked traffic. Ancient buildings required repairs. Modernisation seemed far more attractive than preservation. Across Britain, countless medieval districts disappeared beneath demolition crews. Entire neighbourhoods vanished. Buildings that had survived for 500 years were destroyed in a matter of days. Progress, as it turned out, was remarkably efficient. York faced the same pressures. City officials wanted wider roads, better sanitation, easier movement through the growing city. Some people argued that old medieval streets had little practical value in the modern world. The Shambles appeared particularly vulnerable. The buildings leaned at alarming angles. The street was extremely narrow. The structures were undeniably old. From a practical perspective, demolishing everything and starting over probably seemed sensible. History owes a great deal to the fact that not everyone agreed. During the 19th century, attitudes toward the past began changing. Scholars, architects, and local historians increasingly recognized that medieval buildings represented something valuable. They were not simply old, they were irreplaceable. Once destroyed, they could never truly be recreated. Visitors started arriving specifically to see historic streets. Artists painted them, writers described them. Preservation movements gained momentum throughout Britain. Gradually, the Shambles transformed from an obstacle into a treasure. People began restoring buildings rather than replacing them. Repairs were carried out carefully. Historic features were protected. Efforts were made to preserve the street's unique character. For perhaps the first time in its history, the age of the buildings became an advantage rather than a liability. The very features that once seemed outdated now attracted admiration. The leaning upper floors became charming. The narrow street became picturesque. The medieval architecture became valuable. The Shambles had spent centuries trying to survive the future. Now the future was trying to preserve it. Yet preservation brought its own transformation. Because as the 20th century approached, the butcher shops that had defined the street for generations were disappearing. A new type of customer was arriving. One interested less in buying meat and more in buying memories. For hundreds of years, the Shambles had one primary purpose. It sold meat. Generation after generation of butchers worked behind the same shop fronts. Customers arrived each morning looking for fresh cuts. Animals were slaughtered, prepared and sold. Blood flowed through gutters. Flies buzzed overhead. The smell alone ensured that nobody accidentally wandered in without realizing what business was being conducted. Then slowly everything changed. The 19th and 20th centuries brought new regulations, improved sanitation, modern marketplaces, and changing expectations about food production. People increasingly preferred their meat to arrive with fewer visible reminders that it had once possessed legs. Centralized slaughterhouses became more common. Dedicated markets handled food distribution more efficiently. Modern hygiene standards emerged. This was excellent news for public health. It was less exciting for the local flies. As the butcher trade declined, the street entered a period of uncertainty. Many traditional businesses disappeared. Buildings that had once housed thriving family enterprises needed new purposes. Some streets might have faded into obscurity. The Shambles did the exact opposite. Its survival suddenly became its greatest asset. Visitors began arriving specifically because the street looked medieval. Artists painted it. Photographers captured it. Historians wrote about it. Tourists wandered through simply to experience a place that seemed untouched by time. The irony was impossible to miss. For centuries, residents had endured the inconveniences of narrow streets, aging buildings, poor lighting, and difficult living conditions. Now people were travelling hundreds of miles to admire those inconveniences. The buildings themselves adapted once again. Former butcher shops became gift stores. Old commercial spaces became cafes. Historic buildings housed businesses that medieval residents could never have imagined. Some sold books, some sold souvenirs, some sold products that would have been completely incomprehensible to a 14th century butcher. Imagine trying to explain collectible refrigerator magnets to a medieval merchant. You would probably be accused of witchcraft. Tourism transformed the street's economy. Instead of serving local residents purchasing necessities, the Shambles increasingly catered to visitors seeking experiences. The street became famous around the world. Films, television programs, travel guides, and social media helped spread its image far beyond York. Millions of people who had never visited England recognised its distinctive appearance. And yet, despite all the changes, something remarkable remained. The building still stood, the same crooked timber frames, the same narrow route, the same centuries-old foundations. Beneath the modern shops and smiling visitors, the medieval street endured. But as tourists walk beneath those leaning buildings today, most never realise just how much history surrounds them, or how much darkness still hides in plain sight. Today, the Shambles is one of the most visited streets in Britain. Visitors arrive early in the morning before the crowds. They photograph the leaning buildings. They admire the timber frames. They browse the shops. They enjoy the atmosphere. Most leave with pleasant memories. Very few leave thinking about blood-filled gutters. History has a remarkable ability to clean itself up. Not literally, of course. Medieval York spent centuries struggling with that particular challenge. But over time, uncomfortable details fade while picturesque details survive. The beautiful buildings remain. The smells disappear. The photographs survive. The suffering is forgotten. As you walk through the Shambles today, it is difficult to imagine what the street once looked like. The polished shop windows replace butcher stalls. Tourists replace livestock. The aroma of coffee replaces the scent of freshly slaughtered animals. For modern visitors, the street feels almost magical. For much of its history, it felt considerably less magical and considerably more sticky. The residents who lived here were not characters in a fantasy story. They were ordinary people facing extraordinary hardships. They endured disease outbreaks that could kill neighbours within days. They survived brutal winters without modern heating. They watched fires threaten entire neighbourhoods. They buried family members during plague epidemics. They worked long hours simply to earn enough money to survive another week. And they did all of this while living in buildings that occasionally appeared to be engaged in a slow-motion collapse. Yet somehow, generation after generation persevered. That perseverance is the real story of the Shambles. Not the architecture, not the tourism, not even the history itself. The people. The butcher who opened his shop before dawn. The apprentice carrying supplies through muddy streets. The mother trying to keep children healthy during an outbreak of disease. The merchant rebuilding after a fire. The families who remained when others fled. Their names are mostly forgotten. Their struggles rarely appear in guidebooks. But without them, the Shambles would not exist. Every beam in these buildings was raised by human hands. Every shop survived because someone worked to keep it alive. Every century left behind countless stories that never entered official records. And that may be why the Shambles remain so fascinating. It is not merely a collection of old buildings. It is a monument to ordinary survival. A place where beauty emerged from hardship. A place where centuries of struggle became centuries of history. The tourists see the fairy tale. The buildings remember everything else. And perhaps that is the strangest thing about the Shambles. Its darker past is not hidden underground. It is not locked away in forgotten archives. It stands openly before millions of visitors every year, hidden in plain sight, beneath every crooked beam and every leaning wall, waiting patiently for those willing to look a little closer. The street has never forgotten. Only the rest of us have. If you stand on the shambles early in the morning, before the crowds arrive and before the shop doors open, the street feels different. The noise fades. The modern world pulls back for a moment. And for a few brief minutes, it becomes easier to understand why this place has fascinated people for centuries. The buildings still lean overhead exactly as they have for generations. The narrow street still follows the same route, worn by countless feet, long before automobiles, electricity, or even the concept of a weekend existed. Every stone has witnessed history, not the grand history found in textbooks, not kings signing treaties or armies winning battles. The other kind of history, the kind most people actually lived. For nearly 1,000 years, ordinary men and women walked this street carrying out ordinary lives. A butcher hurrying to open his shop before sunrise. A merchant worrying about debts. An apprentice dreaming of one day owning a business. A mother carrying food home for her family. A child chasing friends through the crowded lane. None of them knew they were living inside a future tourist attraction. They were simply trying to get through another day. That is what makes the Shambles remarkable. Its survival is not just architectural, it is human. The street survived because generations of people repaired it, rebuilt it, worked within it, and refused to abandon it. When plague struck, they remained. When fires threatened, they rebuilt. When businesses failed, new ones appeared. When entire centuries passed, life continued. The buildings standing today are the visible part of that story. The invisible part belongs to the people. The thousands of forgotten lives that shaped this place brick by brick, beam by beam, year after year. Visitors often describe the Shambles as stepping into the past. In reality, the past never left. It lingers in the warped timber frames. It hides beneath the cobblestones. It echoes through the narrow spaces between buildings. The street may look charming now. It may appear peaceful. But behind every postcard view lies a history filled with blood, disease, hardship, fear, resilience, and survival. That is the true story of the Shambles. Not a fairy tale, not a fantasy, but 1,000 years of ordinary people enduring extraordinary circumstances, and somehow, against all odds, leaving behind one of the most famous streets in the world, a street that still stands today, still leaning, still enduring, and still quietly telling its story to anyone willing to slow down and listen. Long before the first cauldron began to simmer, and before a single harp string was plucked, the feast was already underway in the minds of the Celtic tribes. Across the countryside, word spread that a gathering was approaching. There were no printed invitations, no carefully designed event posters, and certainly no complaints about parking. Instead, travellers carried news from settlement to settlement. Farmers heard it while trading livestock. Hunters learned of it while returning from the forests. Soon, entire communities knew that the time had come to gather. The roads leading toward the chosen meeting place gradually filled with people. Families travelled together, bringing carts loaded with supplies, blankets, tools, and food. Children ran ahead excitedly, while older relatives moved at a pace that suggested they had attended enough feasts to know that rushing accomplished very little. For many Celts, these gatherings were among the most important events of the year. Daily life was often spent working fields, tending animals, repairing homes, and surviving the endless demands of a world that seemed determined to break carts, ruin crops, and produce rain at the least convenient moments. A feast offered something different. It was a chance to see distant relatives, exchange news, settle disputes, arrange marriages, and remind neighbouring communities that they were part of something larger. As people arrived, temporary camps began to form around the main settlement. Fires appeared across the landscape like scattered stars. The smell of wood smoke drifted through the air. Conversation started immediately. Someone always had news. Someone always had gossip. Someone always claimed to have wrestled a bear, defeated 10 raiders, or caught the largest boar in tribal history. The accuracy of these stories generally became less important as the evening progressed. The tribal leaders and nobles also arrived with their entourages. Their presence added prestige to the gathering, but feasts were not simply political events. Everyone had a role. Farmers brought grain, hunters brought meat, craftsmen carried goods to trade, musicians arrived with instruments carefully protected from the weather, which in Celtic lands was often as unpredictable as tribal politics. By the time the sun began to sink below the hills, hundreds of people might be gathered together. Fires crackled, voices echoed across the camp. The great feast had not yet begun, but anticipation filled the air. Tomorrow there would be food, music, stories, and celebration. Tonight, an entire community was coming together. With the gathering now underway, attention turned toward the most important question facing any large Celtic feast. What exactly was everyone going to eat? Feeding a few hundred people was no small task. Feeding several thousand was an undertaking that required weeks of preparation. Unlike modern celebrations, there was no convenient marketplace waiting nearby, and certainly no wagon arriving with emergency supplies, because someone underestimated how many guests would attend. If preparations failed, everyone would know about it, probably for years. Fortunately, the Celts took feasting seriously. In the days before the celebration, hunting parties ventured into forests and hills in search of game. Deer were among the most prized targets. Wild boar were even more impressive. Bringing down a massive boar was dangerous work, requiring courage, skill, and a willingness to charge toward an animal equipped with several sharp opinions about being hunted. Success in the hunt brought prestige. The hunter who returned with a large animal did more than provide food. He brought honour to his family and demonstrated his value to the community. Around Celtic campfires, a successful hunt could become a story retold for generations, often gaining additional details each time it was told. By the 10th retelling, the boar usually resembled a small dragon, yet hunting supplied only part of the feast. Most of the meat came from domesticated animals. Cattle held particular importance in Celtic society. Wealth was often measured in livestock rather than coins. A chieftain with large herds possessed power, influence, and the ability to host magnificent feasts. During major celebrations, selected cattle were slaughtered to feed the gathered crowds. Sheep and pigs also contributed to the enormous meals. The sacrifice of valuable animals demonstrated generosity and status. A leader who hosted a poor feast appeared weak. A leader who provided abundance earned admiration and loyalty. Meanwhile, women and servants prepared grains, dairy products, and vegetables. Barley was ground into flour for bread. Oats were cooked into hearty dishes. Butter, cheese, and fresh milk supplemented the meat-heavy menu. Apples, berries, nuts, and honey added sweetness that many participants rarely enjoyed in such quantities. Everywhere there was activity. Knives sharpened. Fires were prepared. Meat was butchered and preserved. Huge cauldrons were cleaned and positioned over hearths. By evening, the entire settlement buzzed with anticipation. The musicians had arrived. The storytellers were gathering, and the scent of roasting meat was beginning to drift across the camp, announcing that the feast itself was finally drawing near. As the preparations reached their peak, the true heart of the Celtic feast began to reveal itself. The cauldrons were brought out. To modern eyes, a cooking pot might seem like an ordinary household object. To the Celts, however, the cauldron carried a far greater significance. It was a symbol of abundance, hospitality, and even spiritual power. Some legends spoke of magical cauldrons that never emptied, feeding endless numbers of warriors. Whether such miraculous cookware actually existed was another matter. The average cook still had to spend hours stirring. The largest cauldrons were enormous bronze vessels capable of feeding hundreds of people. Positioned over roaring fires, they became the centre of activity throughout the feast grounds. Servants and cooks moved constantly around them, adding ingredients and monitoring the contents. Into these great pots went chunks of beef, pork, mutton, and venison. Root vegetables were added when available. Herbs gathered from the countryside provided flavour. Grain thickened the mixture into hearty stews capable of satisfying even the hungriest warrior. And warriors were famously hungry. Many Celtic fighters considered large appetites a point of pride. A feast offered them the perfect opportunity to demonstrate this talent. Unlike skill with a spear, however, excessive eating often produced consequences that became painfully clear later in the evening. As the food cooked, crowds gathered around the fires. The smell alone was enough to attract attention. Rich aromas drifted through the settlement, mixing with wood smoke and the scent of freshly baked bread. The distribution of food followed social customs. Chieftains, nobles, honoured guests, and famous warriors often received the finest cuts of meat. Certain portions carried special prestige. The choicest cut might be awarded to the bravest warrior or the most respected guest. This occasionally caused arguments. Ancient Irish stories describe fierce disputes over who deserved the champion's portion of meat. In some cases, these disagreements escalated into wrestling matches, duels, or full-scale brawls. Apparently, determining who deserved the best piece of beef was considered a matter of national importance. Fortunately, most feasts remained peaceful. As darkness settled across the gathering, wooden bowls were filled and passed among the crowd. Families sat together around fires. Travelers shared meals with strangers. Laughter spread through the camp. For a few precious hours, worries about harvests, rival tribes, and daily hardships faded into the background. The great cauldrons had done their job. The people were fed. Now it was time for the music to begin. With stomachs full and the great cauldrons gradually emptying, the feast entered its second life. The food had brought the people together. The music would keep them there. As darkness settled across the countryside, musicians emerged from among the gathered crowds, carrying instruments that had entertained Celtic communities for generations. Harps, pipes, horns, drums, and stringed instruments appeared around the fires. Some were finely crafted possessions owned by respected performers. Others looked as though they had survived several generations of enthusiastic use. No one seemed particularly concerned about perfection. Celtic music was not something reserved for grand halls or silent audiences. It was meant to be experienced collectively. People sang along, clapped, danced, and occasionally joined in despite possessing very little musical talent. Fortunately, after enough cups of ale, standards became remarkably flexible. The harp often held a special place among Celtic instruments. Skilled harpists enjoyed considerable respect. Their music could accompany celebrations, honour important guests, or provide a fitting backdrop for stories of heroes and gods. Nearby, drummers established steady rhythms that echoed across the camp. Pipes added sharp melodies that carried through the night air. The combined sound transformed the gathering into something almost magical. Soon dancing began. Young men and women joined circles around the fires. Friends grabbed one another by the arms and moved to familiar rhythms. Some dances were energetic enough to leave participants breathless. Others moved at a slower pace, offering opportunities for conversation and courtship. For many young people, the feast was one of the few chances to meet potential partners from neighbouring communities. Parents often noticed these interactions with great interest. Young couples attempted to appear casual. Parents attempted to appear discreet. Neither side was usually very convincing. Meanwhile, older members of the community gathered near the edges of the celebration. They watched the dancing, shared drinks, and occasionally commented on how things had been done differently in their youth. This tradition has apparently survived every civilization in history. As the night deepened, the music continued without interruption. One group of musicians rested while another took their place. New songs followed old ones. Familiar melodies passed from generation to generation. The feast was no longer simply a meal. It had become a living expression of the tribe itself. Around the flickering fires, surrounded by laughter and music, people strengthened friendships, forged new bonds, and celebrated the community that connected them all. And before long, another ancient tradition would take centre stage. The storytellers were preparing to speak. As the music softened, and some of the dancers finally surrendered to exhaustion, another group stepped forward to claim the attention of the gathering. The storytellers. In a Celtic world with no printed books, no libraries, and certainly no endless stream of distractions arriving every few minutes, stories served a purpose far greater than simple entertainment. Stories preserved history. Stories taught lessons. Stories kept entire cultures alive. Around the fires, crowds gathered closer as experienced storytellers prepared to speak. These men and women possessed remarkable memories. Some could recite genealogies stretching back generations. Others knew ancient legends that took hours, sometimes even days, to tell properly. The audience settled into silence. A good storyteller could command a crowd more effectively than many kings. The tales often began with heroes. Great warriors battled monsters, defended kingdoms, and accomplished impossible feats. Legendary figures such as Cuchulainn appeared in countless stories, performing acts of bravery that became slightly more impressive every time they were retold. Sometimes much more impressive. A warrior who defeated 3 enemies in one generation might somehow defeat 30 in the next. Historical accuracy occasionally found itself losing arguments against dramatic storytelling. The listeners rarely complained. Beyond heroes, storytellers shared myths involving gods, spirits, and magical beings. The Celtic world was filled with unseen forces. Forests, rivers, hills, and lakes all carried stories. Many people believed supernatural beings lived alongside humanity, occasionally helping, tricking, or terrifying those unfortunate enough to cross their paths. Children listened with wide eyes. Adults listened too, though they often pretended they were only supervising the children. The stories also carried practical wisdom. Through legends and folk tales, communities passed along lessons about courage, loyalty, generosity, and leadership. A memorable story could teach values far more effectively than a lecture. Meanwhile, the bards held a special role within Celtic society. These professional poets and historians preserved the memories of tribes and noble families. They remembered victories, alliances, and family lineages. In many ways, they served as living archives. This gave them considerable influence. After all, if the person responsible for preserving your reputation disliked you, future generations might remember you somewhat differently than you had hoped. As the firelight flickered across attentive faces, old stories continued flowing into the night. Some inspired laughter, others inspired wonder, and some reminded everyone gathered there that they belonged to a people whose history stretched far beyond any single lifetime. For the Celts, memory itself was part of the feast. By now, the feast had been underway for hours. The food had been eaten, the music had filled the night. The storytellers had carried listeners into worlds of heroes and spirits. Naturally, it was time for alcohol to begin influencing the quality of everyone's decision-making. The Celts were no strangers to drinking. Feasts provided the perfect opportunity for ale, mead, and imported wines to flow freely among the gathered crowds. Drinking was not merely recreation, it was woven into hospitality, celebration, and social bonding. A host who offered generous amounts of drink demonstrated wealth and status. A guest who accepted the drink showed friendship and respect. At least that was the theory. In practice, some guests demonstrated their respect with such enthusiasm that they struggled to remain upright by midnight. Ale was the most common drink. Brewed from barley and other grains, it varied greatly in strength and quality. One settlement might produce a smooth, enjoyable ale. Another might produce something that tasted like wet bread mixed with regret. People drank it anyway. Mead, made from fermented honey, was especially prized. Its sweetness made it popular during major celebrations, and producing large quantities required resources that not everyone possessed. Sharing mead signalled abundance. Imported wine carried even greater prestige. Through trade networks stretching across Europe, some Celtic elites acquired wine from Mediterranean merchants. Possessing foreign wine was a clear display of wealth. It also offered excellent opportunities for showing off. A chieftain presenting imported wine to guests was making a statement. The statement was generally, "Look how important I am." As drinking continued, conversations grew louder. Friendly debates emerged around the fires. Warriors discussed past battles. Hunters compared achievements. Merchants negotiated trades. The accuracy of these conversations gradually declined as the evening progressed. A hunter who had killed one large boar in the morning might somehow have defeated 3 by midnight. By dawn, the animal might be breathing fire. Yet despite the exaggerations, drinking served an important purpose. Shared cups reinforced social bonds. Alliances were strengthened. Disputes were settled. Friendships deepened. Of course, not every gathering remained perfectly peaceful. Ancient sources occasionally describe arguments breaking out during feasts. Strong personalities combined with strong drink could produce memorable results. Fortunately, tribal elders and respected leaders often intervened before disagreements escalated into something requiring medical attention. Most of the time, laughter won. The fires burned lower. The stars wheeled overhead. And throughout the camp, cups continued to pass from hand to hand as another unforgettable Celtic night carried on toward dawn. As dawn approached and the feast entered its later stages, attention began to shift toward another important part of Celtic gatherings: trade. Not the boring kind involving endless paperwork and signatures. The Celtic version involved colourful goods, lively bargaining, and occasional attempts to convince someone that a perfectly ordinary knife was actually a legendary artifact of tremendous importance. Large feasts attracted people from many settlements, creating rare opportunities for exchange. Farmers, hunters, blacksmiths, craftsmen, merchants and travellers all arrived carrying goods they hoped to trade. Temporary markets appeared around the edges of the gathering. Tables, blankets and wooden stalls displayed everything from jewellery and weapons to pottery and textiles. The atmosphere buzzed with activity as buyers and sellers negotiated prices. Money existed in some Celtic regions, but barter remained common. A fine cloak might be exchanged for livestock. A collection of tools could be traded for grain or leather. Every transaction involved conversation, negotiation, and often a considerable amount of friendly stubbornness. No Celtic trader wanted to appear too eager. That would suggest the other person was getting the better deal. Some negotiations lasted longer than the actual crafting of the item being sold. The finest craftsmen often became minor celebrities during these gatherings. Blacksmiths displayed beautifully forged swords, spearheads and tools. Skilled metalworkers presented intricate brooches and ornaments decorated with the swirling patterns that became famous throughout the Celtic world. People admired these objects not only for their usefulness, but also for what they represented. Status. A beautifully crafted sword announced that its owner was wealthy enough to possess something beyond basic necessity. An elaborate brooch suggested prestige. Fine clothing signaled success. Human beings, it seemed, had always enjoyed impressing one another. Gift-giving also played an important role. Chieftains distributed valuable items to loyal followers. These gifts rewarded service, strengthened alliances, and demonstrated generosity. A leader who shared wealth gained respect. A leader who hoarded it gained enemies. The choice was usually straightforward. Visiting tribes often exchanged gifts as well. Decorative objects, livestock, imported goods, and luxury items moved between communities, reinforcing relationships that could later prove valuable during times of conflict or hardship. As the day continued, countless small exchanges took place across the gathering grounds. Some involved wealth, some involved friendship, some involved a merchant somehow convincing a customer that a slightly dented shield possessed tremendous historical significance. Regardless of the details, trade helped bind the Celtic world together. The feast was not only a celebration, it was also a marketplace where relationships, reputations, and fortunes could all change before the final fire burned out. Beneath the laughter, the music, the trading, and the endless consumption of food and drink, there was another layer to the Celtic feast, a sacred one. To the Celts, the gathering was not simply a social event. It was also a moment when the community connected with forces larger than itself. The changing seasons, the land, the ancestors, and the gods all played a role in these celebrations. Many major feasts coincided with important points in the yearly cycle. Beltane marked the arrival of summer. Samhain signalled the beginning of winter. Imbolc welcomed the first signs of spring. Lughnasadh celebrated the harvest. These festivals helped structure the year and reminded people that their lives depended on rhythms far older than any tribe or kingdom. During such gatherings, druids often played an important role. The druids were not merely priests. They acted as scholars, judges, teachers, advisors, and keepers of sacred traditions. Their knowledge commanded respect throughout Celtic society. When a druid spoke during a ceremony, people listened, partly because of respect, partly because ignoring the individual believed to possess deep spiritual knowledge seemed like an unnecessary gamble. Around sacred fires, prayers and rituals were performed. Offerings might be made to the gods in gratitude for successful harvests, healthy livestock, or victories in battle. Sometimes food was offered, sometimes valuable objects. Occasionally weapons were deposited in rivers, lakes, or bogs as gifts to supernatural powers. Archaeologists have spent centuries discovering these offerings and wondering how many ancient warriors explained the loss of their favourite sword to an extremely skeptical blacksmith. The ancestors were remembered as well. Many Celts believed the dead remained connected to the living. During festivals, especially Samhain, the boundary between worlds was thought to become thinner. Spirits might visit, ancestors might draw near. This belief added a sense of mystery to the celebrations. As darkness fell and fires flickered across the landscape, stories of spirits, gods, and ancient heroes felt much more convincing than they did in daylight. Even the bravest warriors occasionally found themselves glancing into the darkness beyond the firelight. Purely out of curiosity, of course, the sacred rituals reminded everyone that the feast was about more than enjoyment. It celebrated survival. It honoured the land that sustained the tribe. It acknowledged the generations that came before and the generations yet to come. For a brief moment, the living, the dead, and the divine all seemed connected around the same fires. Eventually, even the greatest feast had to come to an end. The music slowed. The storytellers grew quiet. The great cauldron stood nearly empty, and across the gathering grounds the first signs of departure began to appear. For days, sometimes longer, the feast had transformed an ordinary settlement into the centre of an entire region's social life. Thousands of conversations had taken place. New friendships had formed. Old rivalries had been eased. Marriages had been discussed. Alliances had been strengthened. Now people faced the difficult reality of returning to everyday life. The transition was not always welcome. After all, it is considerably more enjoyable to spend the day listening to music, eating roasted meat, and sharing stories than it is to repair fences, clear fields, or chase livestock that have once again discovered creative ways to escape. Yet life demanded attention. Families began packing their belongings. Merchants secured unsold goods. Travellers prepared carts and horses for the journey home. The temporary camps that had filled the landscape gradually started to disappear. Around the dying fires, people exchanged final farewells. Some promised to meet again at the next gathering. Some arranged future visits. Some likely made promises they fully intended to keep until confronted with several days of travel and terrible weather. Such realities were hardly unique to Celtic society. The chieftains and leaders also departed carrying valuable outcomes from the feast. Alliances had been renewed. Disputes had been settled. Loyalty had been reinforced through hospitality and generosity. A successful feast strengthened a leader's position. A memorable feast strengthened an entire community. The effects often lasted long after the final fire had gone out. Children returned home with memories that would remain with them for years. Young couples carried hopes for future marriages. Warriors carried stories of contests and celebrations. Storytellers carried new tales gathered from distant visitors. And perhaps most importantly, everyone returned with a stronger sense of belonging. The Celtic world was made up of countless tribes, clans, and settlements scattered across forests, hills, valleys, and coastlines. Daily life could often feel isolated. Feasts reminded people that they were part of something larger. They shared traditions, they shared stories, they shared ancestors. As the last travellers disappeared down winding roads and smoke drifted into the morning sky, the gathering finally came to an end. But its purpose endured. Because for the Celtic tribes, a feast was never simply about food, it was about community. And in a world filled with uncertainty, community was often the greatest treasure of all. For most of human history, drinking too much was not always considered a mistake. Sometimes it was considered a skill. In fact, entire communities gathered to watch men and women consume staggering amounts of alcohol in contests that blurred the line between celebration, endurance test, and collective lapse in judgment. Across Europe, Asia, and beyond, drinking competitions became a way to earn status, settle arguments, impress rulers, and occasionally shorten one's life expectancy. The strange part is that many participants were genuinely admired for it. Today, winning a contest by consuming 10 mugs of ale might earn concerned looks from friends and perhaps a conversation with a doctor. In the past, it could earn fame, respect, and stories that survived for generations. The roots of drinking competitions stretch back thousands of years. Alcohol played an important role in many societies. It accompanied religious ceremonies, political negotiations, military victories, weddings, funerals, harvest festivals, and practically any event involving more than 3 people standing in the same place. Eventually someone had an idea. What if we turned drinking into a competition? History never fully recovered. Ancient feasts often featured participants attempting to outdrink one another. Warriors measured toughness not only through combat, but also through their ability to remain standing after consuming quantities of alcohol that would challenge a modern brewery. Kings entertained guests with lavish drinking events. Nobles competed for prestige. Sailors challenged one another in ports. Entire villages sometimes treated excessive drinking as a spectator event. The rules varied. Sometimes contestants drank from horns, sometimes from goblets, and sometimes from vessels so large they appeared better suited for transporting water than consuming it. Victory was usually simple. The last person capable of functioning won. The definition of functioning, however, could be remarkably flexible. In many accounts, contestants were considered successful if they could still speak, walk, identify their own relatives, or avoid falling directly into a fire. Expectations were different in those days. Yet these contests reveal something fascinating about human nature. Again and again, across different cultures and centuries, people transformed ordinary activities into competitions. Running became races, fighting became tournaments, throwing objects became sports, and drinking became an arena where legends were born. Some competitors would challenge kings, some would humble entire groups of rivals, and a few would become so famous for their drinking exploits that centuries later, historians are still trying to determine whether the stories were true or simply the result of witnesses being equally drunk. If drinking competitions had a spiritual homeland, ancient Greece would certainly qualify as a strong contender. The Greeks did not simply drink. They turned drinking into an art form, a social institution, and occasionally a full-contact intellectual exercise. Their famous drinking gatherings, known as symposia, were among the most important social events in Greek society. Aristocrats, politicians, poets, philosophers, and military leaders gathered in specially prepared rooms to drink wine, discuss ideas, enjoy entertainment, and demonstrate varying levels of self-control, usually decreasing levels. The symposium often began in a relatively civilized manner. Guests reclined on couches arranged around the room. Food was served, conversations flowed, musicians performed, poetry was recited, then the wine arrived. Lots of wine. Unlike many later cultures, the Greeks generally diluted their wine with water. Drinking unmixed wine was often viewed as barbaric behaviour. The ratio varied depending on the occasion, the host, and how quickly everyone wanted the evening to descend into chaos. A moderate symposium might mix 3 parts water to 1 part wine. A less moderate symposium might abandon such restraint entirely. To oversee the event, participants selected a symposiarch. This individual determined how strong the wine would be, and how quickly guests were expected to drink. In modern terms, imagine appointing the most responsible person in the room and then giving them authority over everyone's alcohol consumption. What could possibly go wrong? The Greeks also enjoyed drinking games. One of the most popular was Kottabos, in which players flung the remains of their wine toward targets across the room. This combined drinking with the challenge of throwing liquid indoors. Civilization was advancing rapidly. Success at a symposium required more than simply consuming alcohol. A participant was expected to drink heavily while still maintaining wit, conversation, and dignity. Philosophers debated complex ideas. Politicians negotiated alliances. Poets improvised verses. The challenge was accomplishing these tasks after several hours of drinking. Some succeeded brilliantly. Others became examples of why moderation had been invented. Greek literature contains countless stories of drinking champions capable of astonishing consumption. Certain guests earned reputations for remaining coherent long after everyone else had surrendered to intoxication. These men became legends at banquets throughout the Greek world. Yet even the Greeks understood the danger. Many writers warned against excess. The ideal participant demonstrated balance rather than recklessness. Of course, advice about moderation tends to lose influence around the same time someone announces another round. And in ancient Greece, there was almost always another round waiting. While the Greeks preferred to combine their drinking with philosophy, poetry, and intellectual debates, the Vikings approached the subject from a somewhat different angle. They combined it with competition, and occasionally threats. In the Viking world, feasting occupied a central place in society. Great halls echoed with stories, laughter, songs, and the constant passing of drinking horns. After successful raids, important alliances, weddings, or seasonal festivals, communities gathered to celebrate. No celebration was considered complete without alcohol. Mead flowed freely. Ale was consumed in impressive quantities. Wealthy chieftains demonstrated their status by providing enough drink to satisfy entire settlements. A stingy host earned criticism. A generous host earned loyalty. A host who ran out of alcohol halfway through a feast risked becoming a story himself. The Vikings viewed drinking as closely connected to honour and courage. Warriors were expected to demonstrate toughness not only on the battlefield but also at the feast table. This naturally led to drinking contests. A challenge might begin with a simple boast. One warrior claimed he could drink more than another. The other disagreed. Several hours later, both men regretted becoming involved. The Icelandic sagas are filled with stories of competitive drinking. Many describe warriors attempting to outdrink rivals, while simultaneously exchanging insults, boasting about heroic deeds, or arguing about whose ancestors were more impressive. The arguments often became increasingly creative as the evening progressed. A man who began by claiming his grandfather owned a successful farm might eventually describe an ancestor who personally wrestled sea monsters while conquering distant kingdoms. The audience generally accepted these developments with remarkable patience. Some rulers actively encouraged drinking competitions. A king who could outdrink his guests projected strength and authority. A warrior who remained standing after everyone else collapsed gained prestige. The ability to handle alcohol became part of a person's reputation. This was not always wise. Several sagas describe feasts that began peacefully before deteriorating into fights, blood feuds, or long-lasting rivalries. Alcohol had a tendency to amplify existing tensions. If two men already disliked one another, consuming large amounts of mead rarely improved the situation. Still, the Viking drinking duel remained a respected tradition. Victory was not measured by elegance or refinement. It was measured by endurance. Who could continue drinking? Who could remain conscious? Who could somehow navigate the hall without colliding with furniture? For the Vikings, these questions carried genuine importance, because in a society that admired toughness above almost everything else, surviving a drinking contest was viewed as one more way to prove your worth, even if the next morning offered compelling evidence that it had been a terrible idea. If the Vikings turned drinking into a test of toughness, the Romans transformed it into a display of wealth, status, and political power. No one embodied this better than the emperors and aristocrats who hosted some of history's most extravagant drinking competitions. Roman banquets were legendary throughout the ancient world. Guests entered dining rooms filled with exotic foods, expensive decorations, musicians, entertainers, and enough wine to make poor decisions on an imperial scale. These feasts could last for hours. Sometimes they lasted all night. Occasionally they seemed determined to continue until someone forgot why the banquet had started in the first place. Wine occupied the centre of everything. Vast quantities arrived from vineyards across the empire. Wealthy hosts proudly served rare vintages imported from distant provinces. The quality of wine reflected the status of the host, and Roman elites cared deeply about status. A banquet was not simply a meal. It was a competition. Guests competed through conversation, displays of wealth, political influence, and, quite often, drinking ability. A nobleman who could consume large amounts of wine while remaining composed gained admiration from his peers, at least until he stopped remaining composed. Several Roman writers complained about excessive drinking among the upper classes. The poet Martial mocked guests who treated banquets as endurance contests. Juvenal filled his writings with sarcastic observations about aristocrats whose judgment disappeared somewhere between their 6th and 10th cup. The Romans themselves were fully aware of the absurdity. That did not stop them. One famous example involved Emperor Tiberius, who reportedly admired individuals capable of astonishing feats of drinking. According to ancient accounts, a man named Lucius Piso became one of his favourites largely because he could drink extraordinary amounts of wine without collapsing. Imagine earning imperial favour because your liver was operating at historically significant levels. It was an unusual career path. Other emperors encouraged equally excessive behaviour. Under rulers such as Nero, banquets became spectacles of indulgence. Guests competed to impress one another through consumption. Drinking challenges spread through the elite circles of Roman society. The atmosphere often blurred the line between celebration and survival exercise. Yet for all their excesses, these competitions served an important social function. Alliances were formed over cups of wine. Political deals emerged during banquets. Friendships were strengthened. Enemies occasionally became even greater enemies. As the empire grew richer, the drinking contests grew larger, and while Roman armies conquered distant lands, Roman nobles were busy conquering goblets, amphorae, and every available source of wine. History remembers many Roman achievements. Inventing professional-level overindulgence deserves at least an honourable mention. When people imagine medieval monks, they often picture quiet men spending their days praying, copying manuscripts, and living lives of strict discipline. Much of that image is accurate. The part people tend to forget is the beer, a tremendous amount of beer. Throughout medieval Europe, monasteries became some of the continent's greatest producers of alcohol. Monks brewed beer, cultivated vineyards, and perfected techniques that influenced drinking culture for centuries. In many regions, monastery breweries produced beverages that were safer to drink than local water supplies. This created an interesting situation. The people responsible for promoting spiritual discipline also happened to be among the most skilled alcohol producers in Europe. History enjoys irony. Monastic rules varied from place to place, but many communities permitted regular consumption of beer and wine. During meals, monks often drank moderate amounts as part of daily life. Certain monasteries even maintained generous alcohol allowances. To be fair, medieval beer was often weaker than many modern varieties. To be equally fair, some monks compensated for this by drinking impressive quantities of it. Visitors frequently commented on the quality of monastic brewing. Wealthy nobles, travellers and pilgrims all appreciated the beverages produced behind monastery walls. A monastery known for excellent beer could attract both admiration and income. Not every monk approached this privilege with perfect restraint. Church records occasionally complained about excessive drinking among members of the clergy. Some abbots struggled to enforce moderation. Certain monks developed reputations for treating alcohol less as a dietary supplement and more as a personal calling. Human nature had apparently survived the vows. Feast days often presented the greatest challenges. Religious celebrations could involve large communal meals where beer and wine flowed more freely than usual. Friendly competitions sometimes emerged, especially when guests from neighbouring monasteries visited. No official rulebook encouraged drinking contests. That did not prevent them from happening. Accounts from various parts of medieval Europe describe clergy participating in lengthy feasts, where drinking became a matter of pride. Nobody wanted to appear weak in front of visitors. The result was a surprisingly competitive atmosphere. Of course, most monks remained far more disciplined than the legendary drinkers found in royal courts and military camps. But their story highlights an important truth. Alcohol occupied a central place in medieval society. Whether you were a king, a knight, a merchant, a farmer, or a monk, opportunities to drink were never far away. And sometimes, behind the walls of Europe's monasteries, the men preserving sacred texts were also preserving the ancient tradition of seeing exactly how many cups they could handle before making regrettable decisions. By the early modern period, drinking competitions had moved far beyond village feasts and monastery halls. They had reached royal courts, and few royal courts developed a reputation quite like those of Poland and Lithuania. Visitors from Western Europe often left astonished by what they witnessed. Banquets among the nobility could last for entire days. Drinking was not simply expected. It was practically woven into the social fabric of aristocratic life. Foreign diplomats quickly learned an important lesson. If a Polish noble offered you a drink, refusing could be considered rude. Accepting, however, often led to additional drinks, and then additional drinks after those. Soon, many visitors found themselves trapped in what can only be described as a highly civilized ambush. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was one of the largest and most powerful states in Europe, ruled by a wealthy nobility known as the Szlachta. These nobles took pride in hospitality, generosity, and grand celebrations. Unfortunately for their guests, they also took pride in their drinking capacity. Banquets featured endless toasts. Every important event required one. Military victories received toasts. Political agreements received toasts. Weddings received toasts. Births received toasts. Someone arriving safely after a long journey could expect several toasts before removing their coat. The custom became so famous that foreign travellers frequently wrote about it. Many described drinking rituals that seemed designed to test the physical limits of every participant. A guest might be challenged to empty an enormous cup in a single attempt. Then another. Then another. At some point, survival became the primary objective. Kings occasionally joined these festivities. Royal banquets often evolved into informal drinking competitions where nobles attempted to impress rulers through endurance and enthusiasm. Success brought admiration. Failure brought laughter. In some circles, a nobleman's reputation depended partly on his ability to remain standing after extraordinary amounts of alcohol. This naturally encouraged behaviour that modern medical professionals would describe using very concerned language. Yet these contests were about more than drinking. They helped build friendships and political alliances among a fiercely independent nobility. Shared cups created bonds. Deals were negotiated. Trust was established, at least until everyone forgot the details of the agreement the following morning. By the 17th century, the Commonwealth had earned a reputation across Europe for its spectacular banquets and legendary drinkers. Foreign ambassadors often arrived prepared for difficult negotiations. Many discovered that surviving dinner was the greater challenge, and in the courts of Poland and Lithuania, out-drinking your rivals could sometimes accomplish almost as much as defeating them in politics. If Poland and Lithuania were famous for their drinking culture, Russia elevated the concept to an entirely different level. In the courts of the Russian Tsars, drinking was not merely entertainment, it was often a test. A dangerous one. Foreign diplomats arriving in Russia frequently found themselves invited to lavish banquets where alcohol flowed with remarkable generosity. At first, this seemed like a sign of hospitality. Then the drinking began, and continued some more. Many visitors quickly realized they were participating in an unofficial competition they had never agreed to enter. Russian rulers often viewed drinking as a demonstration of loyalty, strength, and camaraderie. Refusing to drink with the host could be interpreted as disrespectful. Accepting meant entering a battle that involved no weapons but produced casualties nonetheless. Among the most notorious enthusiasts was Peter the Great, standing well over 6 feet tall and possessing an enormous appetite for both food and drink. Peter became famous throughout Europe for his legendary feasts. He surrounded himself with companions who shared his enthusiasm for alcohol. This was not always good news for everyone else. Peter organised gatherings that could last for days. Participants consumed vast quantities of vodka, wine, beer, and imported spirits. Some guests attempted to keep pace with the Tsar. Most failed. Spectacularly, one of Peter's most infamous creations was a drinking society known as the All-Joking, All-Drunken Synod. Despite the absurd name, the group was very real. Members participated in elaborate feasts, drinking rituals, and celebrations that often pushed participants far beyond reasonable limits. Reasonable limits rarely received an invitation. Foreign ambassadors dreaded certain banquets because they knew what awaited them. Reports describe diplomats becoming hopelessly intoxicated while their Russian hosts appeared almost unaffected. Whether the hosts were genuinely immune or simply better trained remains a matter of debate. Probably both. The challenge was not merely consuming alcohol. The challenge was remaining functional afterward. Guests were expected to continue conversations, participate in ceremonies, and maintain proper etiquette while their judgment steadily abandoned them. This produced predictable results, embarrassing speeches, questionable decisions, and memories that fortunately became very blurry. Yet these drinking contests served political purposes. Shared drinking helped establish trust. It demonstrated commitment to relationships and alliances. A guest willing to endure the feast proved his dedication, or perhaps his inability to escape. Either way, the Russian court became famous across Europe for its extraordinary drinking culture, and for countless visitors, surviving a banquet with the Tsar felt every bit as challenging as surviving a diplomatic negotiation. By the 19th century, drinking competitions had crossed oceans and frontiers, and nowhere did they find a more enthusiastic audience than the American Wild West. The frontier was a hard place to live. Settlers faced isolation, extreme weather, dangerous work, and constant uncertainty. After long days spent ranching, mining, herding cattle, or travelling across vast distances, many people sought relief in the same place. The saloon. Every frontier town seemed to have one. Some towns had several. A few appeared to have more saloons than permanent residents. Inside these establishments, alcohol flowed almost continuously. Cowboys, prospectors, gamblers, lawmen, merchants, and travellers gathered around wooden bars that became the social centres of frontier life. Naturally, competition followed. A man who claimed he could outshoot everyone in town often also claimed he could outdrink everyone in town. Whether either claim was true varied considerably. Bragging was practically a local currency. Stories of legendary drinkers spread throughout the frontier. Certain individuals earned reputations for consuming astonishing amounts of whiskey while remaining surprisingly functional, at least according to their friends, and their friends were usually drinking too. One famous example was the frontiersman and lawman Wyatt Earp, who witnessed countless drinking contests throughout his life. Figures such as Doc Holliday also became associated with the hard drinking culture of the West. Holliday in particular seemed determined to challenge both tuberculosis and common sense simultaneously. Many contests were informal. Two rivals would sit down at a bar and begin ordering rounds. Spectators gathered. Bets were placed. The competitors continued drinking until one admitted defeat, collapsed, or became physically incapable of locating the next glass. Victory conditions were not always clearly defined. Mining towns became especially notorious for these competitions. During mining booms, workers suddenly flush with money often celebrated with spectacular enthusiasm. Entire paychecks could disappear in a single evening, sometimes within hours, occasionally within minutes. Saloon owners generally viewed this as excellent news. Yet drinking contests served an important social role. They provided entertainment in isolated communities. They helped newcomers earn acceptance. They created stories that people would retell for years, usually with substantial exaggeration. A man who drank 6 whiskies during one contest might eventually be remembered as someone who consumed 30, while simultaneously winning a poker game and wrestling a bear. The details were flexible. The legend was what mattered, and in the Wild West, where reputation could be almost as valuable as money, becoming known as the toughest drinker in town was a title many pursued, even if the trophy was nothing more than a terrible headache the following morning. After thousands of years of drinking competitions, feasts, royal banquets, tavern challenges, and legendary contests, one pattern appears again and again. People kept trying to discover the absolute limits of human alcohol consumption. History repeatedly demonstrated that this was not an especially good idea, yet generation after generation continued trying. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, attitudes toward drinking competitions slowly began to change. Industrial societies became more organized. Governments grew more concerned about public health. Medical science advanced enough to explain what happened inside the human body during extreme drinking. The findings were not encouraging. It turned out that treating your liver like an undefeated gladiator came with consequences. For centuries, many legendary drinkers had been celebrated as heroes of endurance. Stories praised their ability to consume astonishing quantities of alcohol while remaining conscious, coherent, and occasionally upright. What those stories often omitted were the less glamorous details. The headaches, the illnesses, the shortened lifespans, and the fact that many legendary victories ended with someone sleeping face down in a ditch. Historical records are full of famous figures whose drinking eventually damaged their careers, relationships, and health. Kings lost control of kingdoms. Generals made poor decisions. Noblemen ruined fortunes. More than a few drinking champions discovered that their greatest talent was also their greatest weakness. Even so, the fascination never completely disappeared. Humans have always admired endurance. Whether climbing mountains, running marathons, crossing oceans, or surviving impossible challenges, people are naturally drawn to individuals who push beyond ordinary limits. Drinking competitions simply represented one of history's stranger versions of that impulse. A very strange version. Today, many of the old contests have vanished, but their stories remain. Ancient Greek philosophers attempting to outdrink one another, Viking warriors competing over mead horns, Roman aristocrats emptying endless cups of wine, Russian nobles surviving the banquets of Peter the Great, cowboys testing their reputations in frontier saloons. Each belonged to a different world, yet all shared the same belief, that there was honour, prestige, or glory to be found at the bottom of another cup. Looking back, it is easy to laugh at some of these stories, and honestly, many deserve laughter. But they also reveal something timeless about humanity. People have always competed, people have always bragged, and people have always convinced themselves that one more round was an excellent idea. History suggests otherwise. Then again, history was usually written the next morning. For most people, drinking too much creates a fairly limited disaster. You embarrass yourself at a feast, you wake up with a headache, you spend the next day questioning several decisions. For kings, however, excessive drinking could become a national problem. When an ordinary farmer drank too much ale, a few chickens might go unfed. When a king drank too much wine, armies could be mismanaged, treaties could be signed, and entire kingdoms could find themselves living with the consequences. History is filled with rulers who enjoyed alcohol. Some enjoyed it responsibly. Others approached it with the enthusiasm of a man attempting to personally support the wine industry. Those are the rulers we are concerned with tonight. Throughout history, alcohol occupied an important place in royal life. Banquets celebrated military victories. Feasts honoured foreign ambassadors. Weddings, coronations, religious festivals, hunting trips, and political gatherings all involved drinking. A king who refused to participate risked appearing unfriendly or weak. A king who participated too enthusiastically created a different set of problems. Royal courts often encouraged excess. Wealthy nobles competed to host extravagant feasts. Foreign visitors arrived with gifts of wine and spirits. Servants ensured that cups remained full. Courtiers praised their rulers regardless of how questionable their behaviour became. This was not an environment designed to promote moderation. In fact, it was almost perfectly designed to destroy it. Many rulers developed reputations as legendary drinkers. Their ability to consume enormous quantities of alcohol became part of their public image. Some saw this as proof of strength. Others considered it evidence of courage, masculinity, or divine favour. Modern doctors might have chosen different interpretations. The problem was that kings possessed something most heavy drinkers lacked: power. When a ruler made decisions while intoxicated, those decisions affected millions of people. Wars could begin, alliances could collapse, rivalries could intensify, valuable opportunities could disappear. Sometimes the consequences were immediate. Sometimes they took years to unfold. Either way, entire nations often paid the bill for habits that began at the banquet table. What makes these stories fascinating is that many of these rulers were talented, intelligent, and successful in other aspects of their reigns. Some expanded empires, some reformed governments, some achieved lasting fame. Yet alongside their accomplishments stood another legacy: their inability to put down the cup. And as we will discover, a surprising number of kings spent their reigns balancing crowns on their heads, while attempting to balance wine goblets in their hands. History suggests they were far better at the first task than the second. If there were a historical award for combining military genius with questionable drinking habits, Alexander the Great would be a strong contender. By the age of 32, He had conquered an empire stretching from Greece to India. He defeated armies, toppled kingdoms, founded cities, and accomplished more before his 33rd birthday than most rulers managed in a lifetime. Unfortunately, Alexander also had a well-documented fondness for drinking, a very well-documented fondness. The Macedonian elite viewed drinking as an important part of social life. Banquets were where friendships were strengthened, victories were celebrated, and political alliances were maintained. Alcohol flowed freely, especially among the king's companions. Alexander embraced this tradition enthusiastically. Ancient sources describe drinking parties that lasted deep into the night. Large quantities of wine were consumed, often without the dilution favoured by the Greeks. Macedonian drinking culture prized endurance and toughness. Being able to outdrink your companions was considered admirable, at least until someone started making decisions. Alexander's drinking occasionally produced serious consequences. One of the most famous incidents involved his trusted friend Clytus the Black. During a banquet, an argument broke out. Clytus criticised Alexander's growing adoption of Persian customs. Alexander, already intoxicated, became furious. The disagreement escalated. Insults were exchanged. Then Alexander grabbed a spear. Moments later, Clytus was dead. The king immediately regretted what he had done. Ancient accounts describe Alexander collapsing in grief, horrified by his own actions. Unfortunately, apologies become less effective once a spear has entered the conversation. Yet even this tragedy did not end Alexander's drinking. Years later, in Babylon, he attended what would become his final series of banquets. The exact details remain controversial, but most ancient accounts agree on several points. There was feasting, there was heavy drinking, and shortly afterward, Alexander became gravely ill. For nearly 2 weeks he suffered worsening symptoms before dying in June of 323 BC. His death created one of history's greatest mysteries. Was it malaria? Typhoid fever? An autoimmune illness? Poison? Historians still debate the answer. What nobody debates is that Alexander had spent years placing extraordinary strain on his body. Endless military campaigns, wounds from battle, exhaustion, and frequent drinking had taken their toll. His empire survived him only briefly before fracturing into rival kingdoms. In a cruel twist of history, the man who conquered much of the known world could not conquer his own mortality, and his final chapter began, fittingly enough, at a banquet table with another cup of wine. If Alexander the Great demonstrated how alcohol could contribute to personal tragedy, the Roman Emperor Tiberius showed how excessive drinking could become part of an entire political culture. Tiberius ruled the Roman Empire from AD 14 to AD 37. He inherited a vast and powerful state from Augustus, Rome's first emperor. Intelligent, experienced, and capable, Tiberius was by no means an incompetent ruler. He was, however, surrounded by a court that developed a rather unusual reputation. Roman historians loved gossip almost as much as modern social media, and several writers left colourful accounts of the emperor's drinking circle. Whether every detail is true remains uncertain, but the stories became legendary. One figure stood out above all others, a Roman nobleman named Lucius Piso. According to ancient accounts, Piso possessed an astonishing ability to consume wine. He reportedly spent entire days drinking while somehow remaining functional. This talent impressed Tiberius so much that Piso became one of the emperor's favoured companions. Imagine attending a job interview where your primary qualification was surviving quantities of alcohol that would frighten professional sailors. Rome occasionally worked in mysterious ways. The emperor himself enjoyed lavish banquets and drinking gatherings. These events were not simply parties. Politics happened there. Alliances were formed. Rivalries were managed. Careers were made and destroyed over dinner tables covered with wine cups. The problem was that alcohol tends to make already difficult political situations even more complicated. A careless remark made during a feast could become a serious insult. An argument could become a feud. A rumour could become a conspiracy. And Rome was already a society that produced conspiracies with remarkable efficiency. Roman elites often treated drinking as a sign of sophistication and status. Wealthy aristocrats displayed rare wines imported from across the empire. Guests competed through displays of luxury, conversation, and endurance. The atmosphere encouraged excess. Writers such as Seneca and Pliny frequently criticized the behavior of wealthy Romans who spent fortunes on banquets, while pretending that drinking themselves unconscious was somehow a mark of civilization. To be fair, they occasionally used fancier cups. Yet beneath the luxury lay a serious issue. When political leaders spend large portions of their time feasting and drinking, government tends to suffer. Corruption grows, important decisions are delayed, personal relationships begin outweighing competence. Tiberius eventually withdrew from Rome altogether, spending much of his later reign on the island of Capri. There, according to hostile sources, the emperor's court became even more decadent. Whether exaggerated or not, the stories endured. Because Romans understood a timeless truth. A ruler who enjoys wine is one thing. A ruler surrounded by professional drinkers is something else entirely. When Charlemagne died in AD 814, he left behind one of the most powerful empires Europe had seen since the fall of Rome. He also left behind descendants. History has repeatedly demonstrated that building an empire is often easier than persuading your heirs to behave responsibly. Charlemagne's grandsons inherited enormous wealth, vast territories, and enough political power to shape the future of Europe. What they did not inherit in equal measure was their grandfather's discipline. Among the most notable was Charles the Bald, ruler of West Francia, a kingdom that would eventually become France. Like many aristocrats of his era, Charles lived in a court where wine flowed constantly. Drinking was woven into noble life. Banquets accompanied political negotiations, military celebrations, religious festivals, and nearly every major event. The problem was not that nobles drank. The problem was how much they drank. Medieval chroniclers frequently complained about excessive drinking among the Frankish elite. Feasts could last for days. Noblemen competed to demonstrate generosity through endless supplies of wine and ale. Excessive consumption became a symbol of wealth and prestige. A noble who served modest amounts of wine appeared poor. A noble who served too much appeared successful. The incentives were not exactly encouraging moderation. As Charlemagne's empire fragmented, rival kings and nobles spent enormous amounts of time attending feasts, negotiating alliances, and plotting against one another. Drinking often accompanied all three activities. This was not always ideal for decision-making. Imagine trying to divide one of Europe's largest empires while surrounded by ambitious relatives, armed retainers, and enough wine to impair everyone's judgment. Predictably, things became complicated. The famous Treaty of Verdun in AD 843 eventually divided the empire among Charlemagne's grandsons, creating separate kingdoms that laid foundations for modern France and Germany. The negotiations themselves were serious. The political culture surrounding them was not always so restrained. Medieval courts often blurred the line between diplomacy and celebration. Ambassadors arrived bearing gifts of wine. Noble gatherings featured extravagant feasts. Political agreements were sealed over shared cups. Sometimes this strengthened relationships. Sometimes it strengthened hangovers. Chroniclers occasionally described rulers whose devotion to feasting distracted them from governance. Resources that might have supported armies or infrastructure disappeared into lavish celebrations designed to impress guests. Yet nobody wanted to be the king remembered for serving weak wine. As the Carolingian Empire gradually weakened, external invasions increased, internal rivalries intensified, and royal authority declined. Wine was hardly the sole cause. But it certainly wasn't helping, because while Charlemagne had spent decades building an empire, some of his successors seemed increasingly occupied with building impressive banquet tables. By the time King Edgar the Peaceful ruled England in the 10th century, drinking had become such an ordinary part of daily life that most people barely thought about it. Water was not always reliable. Ale was everywhere. Children drank it, farmers drank it, monks drank it, nobles drank it. If medieval England had possessed modern office meetings, someone probably would have brought ale to those as well. The problem was that many people were drinking far more than Edgar thought was sensible. Unlike some rulers on our list, Edgar was not famous for personally drinking his kingdom into trouble. Instead, he became concerned that excessive drinking was becoming a social problem throughout England. This made him something of an unusual king. Most rulers enjoyed the feast. Edgar looked at the feast and started worrying about crowd control. According to medieval sources, drinking gatherings often became rowdy affairs. Large communal cups were passed around. Participants competed to empty them. Feasts sometimes descended into disorder, as intoxication steadily increased. Apparently, the English had developed an early talent for turning just one drink into an evening-long commitment. Edgar decided something needed to be done. One famous story claims that he introduced drinking regulations designed to reduce excessive consumption. Most notably, drinking vessels were marked with pins or pegs at various levels. The idea was simple. Drinkers were expected to consume only a certain amount at a time rather than draining entire cups in one enthusiastic attempt. It was essentially an early medieval version of telling people to pace themselves. The fact that such measures were considered necessary reveals quite a lot about the drinking culture of the time. Naturally, enforcement proved challenging. People who are determined to drink heavily have historically displayed remarkable creativity when confronted with rules designed to prevent it. This pattern has remained surprisingly consistent, yet Edgar's efforts reflected a larger truth. Alcohol could create problems even when kings themselves remained relatively disciplined. Excessive drinking affected productivity, public order, and social stability. Arguments became fights. Minor disputes became major conflicts. Communities suffered when drunkenness became widespread. A king responsible for maintaining peace could not entirely ignore these consequences. Whether Edgar's reforms achieved lasting success remains debatable. Drinking remained deeply embedded in English culture long after his reign ended. But his story stands out because it reverses the usual pattern. Rather than being a ruler whose love of alcohol became a national problem, Edgar was a ruler attempting to solve a national problem caused by everyone else's love of alcohol. And judging by the next 1,000 years of English history, it was a battle he was never truly going to win. If King Edgar spent part of his reign trying to reduce excessive drinking, the rulers of medieval Scandinavia often found themselves living in societies where drinking was deeply connected to honour, loyalty, and power. Among them was Eric the Good, King of Denmark from AD 1095 to AD 1103. Now, Eric himself was not remembered as a hopeless drunkard. In fact, medieval sources generally portray him as energetic, capable, and popular. Yet his reign offers a window into a culture where royal authority and drinking customs were so closely intertwined that separating the two would have been nearly impossible. In Scandinavia, feasts were not optional social events. They were political necessities. A king maintained loyalty through personal relationships. He rewarded supporters with gifts, hospitality, and grand celebrations. Chieftains expected invitations. Warriors expected food and drink. Guests expected generosity. And generosity was measured partly by what filled their cups. A Scandinavian ruler who hosted poor feasts appeared weak. A ruler who hosted magnificent feasts appeared powerful. The message was simple. If a king could afford endless barrels of ale and mead, he clearly possessed the wealth and influence necessary to lead. The result was a culture where drinking became part of governance itself. Royal halls served as centres of politics. Agreements were reached over drinking horns. Alliances were strengthened during celebrations. Warriors swore oaths while raising cups of mead. New leaders demonstrated their status by hosting enormous gatherings. The atmosphere could be impressive. It could also be chaotic. Medieval Scandinavian literature contains countless stories of feasts that began with singing and storytelling before ending with insults, fights, and occasionally homicide. Alcohol rarely improved already tense situations. A warrior who felt slighted during a feast might carry that resentment for years. An insult spoken after several horns of mead could spark a blood feud. Rivalries between powerful families often grew more dangerous once drinking entered the equation. Kings had to manage these risks carefully. Eric's success partly depended on balancing generosity with authority. He needed loyal supporters, but he also needed order. Too little hospitality weakened his position. Too much indulgence encouraged disorder. It was a delicate balance, and one many rulers struggled to maintain. The Scandinavian feast remained a symbol of royal power throughout the Middle Ages, yet it also revealed one of monarchy's oldest challenges. The very traditions that helped kings gain support could also create the conditions for conflict. Because when politics, pride, weapons, and large quantities of alcohol share the same room, history suggests the evening rarely ends exactly as planned. If previous rulers merely tolerated heavy drinking, Peter the Great of Russia seemed determined to elevate it into a branch of government. Peter ruled from 1682 to 1725 and transformed Russia into a major European power. He modernized the military, reformed the administration, built a new capital city, and dragged his country toward modernization with the subtlety of a cannonball. He was brilliant, he was energetic, and he had an extraordinary appetite for alcohol. Peter stood over 6 feet tall, unusually large for his era, and possessed a legendary capacity for drinking. Contemporary accounts describe banquets that lasted for days, with rivers of wine, beer, and vodka flowing through the imperial court. The Tsar expected his companions to keep pace. This was unfortunate for his companions. One of Peter's favourite creations was a bizarre organisation known as the All-Jesting, All-Drunken Synod, despite sounding like something invented during a particularly enthusiastic tavern conversation. It was real. Members participated in elaborate drinking ceremonies, mock religious processions, absurd costumes, and feasts that tested the limits of human endurance. The goal appeared to be having as much fun as possible while making future historians deeply uncomfortable. Foreign ambassadors dreaded invitations to Peter's banquets. Diplomatic missions often required negotiating trade agreements, military alliances, and political disputes. In Russia, they also required surviving dinner. Visitors frequently reported being pressured to drink enormous quantities of alcohol. Refusing could be interpreted as an insult. Accepting often led to consequences that became increasingly difficult to remember. Many diplomats discovered that the greatest challenge in Russia was not political negotiation. It was remaining conscious. Peter himself viewed drinking as a tool of social bonding. Shared feasts broke down barriers. They encouraged loyalty and camaraderie. The Tsar wanted energetic companions who could match his enthusiasm for life. Unfortunately, not everyone possessed Peter's constitution. Several guests reportedly became seriously ill after attempting to keep up with him. Others simply surrendered long before the evening ended. The court's drinking culture became famous throughout Europe, yet there was a darker side. Heavy drinking contributed to health problems among the nobility and encouraged excess throughout elite society. A ruler's habits often became fashionable among those seeking favour. When the most powerful man in the country treated drinking as a competitive sport, many others followed his example. Peter achieved remarkable things during his reign. His accomplishments reshaped Russian history. But alongside shipbuilding, military reform, and modernisation stood another legacy. He may have been the only ruler in Europe whose dinner invitations inspired as much fear as his armies. By the early 19th century, Europe was changing rapidly. Empires were expanding. Industry was transforming society. Science was advancing. Governments were becoming more sophisticated. And in Britain, King George IV was busy hosting some of the most extravagant parties the kingdom had ever seen. George became one of the most famous examples of a ruler whose love of excess evolved into a national embarrassment. To be fair, alcohol was only part of the problem. There was also overeating, gambling, luxury spending, and a general commitment to indulgence that would have exhausted lesser men. But alcohol remained a constant companion throughout his life. As Prince Regent and later king, George surrounded himself with lavish banquets, expensive wines, and endless celebrations. His dinners became legendary for their extravagance. Guests enjoyed enormous quantities of food, accompanied by some of the finest wines available in Europe. The bills were equally impressive. Unfortunately, British taxpayers were helping cover them. George possessed excellent taste in art, architecture, and fashion. He helped shape the style of an entire era. Yet his personal habits increasingly attracted criticism. Many of his subjects struggled with poverty and economic hardship. The king, meanwhile, appeared committed to discovering whether a human being could survive entirely on luxury. The answer turned out to be complicated. As the years passed, George's health deteriorated dramatically. Excessive eating and drinking contributed to obesity, chronic illness, and declining mobility. Contemporary observers described a ruler who became increasingly bloated and physically fragile. His waistline expanded almost as rapidly as his wine cellar. Political critics seized upon his lifestyle. Newspapers and cartoonists mocked him relentlessly. Satirical artists portrayed the king as a symbol of greed, excess, and self-indulgence. He became one of the most caricatured monarchs in British history, and the artists were not subtle. One famous cartoon after another depicted George as an oversized figure drowning in food and drink, while ordinary Britons struggled outside palace walls. The criticism was not entirely unfair. Unlike some rulers whose drinking directly influenced military campaigns or diplomatic disasters, George's problem was more symbolic. His habits damaged the monarchy's reputation. A king is supposed to embody national virtues. George increasingly embodied the dessert menu. Yet despite everything, he remained enormously influential in cultural matters. His patronage shaped architecture, fashion, and the arts for generations. His reign became a strange contradiction. A man of remarkable taste and terrible restraint. A king who loved beauty, luxury, and celebration. And a ruler whose fondness for the cup gradually became one of the defining features of his public image, whether he liked it or not. Looking across history, it is remarkable how often the same story appears. A talented ruler rises to power. The ruler enjoys drinking. The drinking becomes excessive. Everyone around him pretends everything is perfectly fine. and eventually the consequences arrive, sometimes quickly, sometimes years later. The kings in this story came from different centuries, cultures, and kingdoms. Alexander the Great marched across Asia. Tiberius ruled Rome. Medieval kings governed fragmented European realms. Peter the Great transformed Russia. George IV presided over Britain during an age of enormous change. Yet despite their differences, they shared one important characteristic. None of them truly lived in a world where anyone could tell them no. That was often the real problem. For ordinary people, excessive drinking eventually meets resistance. Friends complain. Family intervenes. Employers become concerned. Reality has a way of imposing limits. Kings existed above many of those limits. Servants refilled their cups. Courtiers laughed at their jokes. Nobles praised their behaviour, even when everyone privately understood that the situation was becoming ridiculous. This created a dangerous environment. A ruler's weaknesses could grow unchecked because admitting those weaknesses existed might be politically risky. As a result, personal habits sometimes became public problems. A drunken argument could spark a diplomatic crisis. A reckless decision made during a feast could alter the course of a war. An unhealthy lifestyle could weaken a monarch at a critical moment for the kingdom. The effects rippled outward through entire societies. What makes these stories fascinating is that alcohol itself was rarely the sole cause of disaster. The real issue was excess. Wine did not divide Charlemagne's empire. Alcohol did not create political rivalries in Rome. Vodka did not single-handedly modernize Russia under Peter the Great. But excessive drinking amplified existing flaws. It magnified poor judgment. It encouraged impulsive decisions. It weakened rulers who already carried enormous responsibilities. History repeatedly demonstrates that power and self-control must work together. When one grows while the other declines, problems usually follow. And yet, despite countless examples, rulers continued making the same mistake. Perhaps because every king believed he could handle one more cup. Every court believed the feast would remain under control. Every generation convinced itself that things would be different this time. History rarely agreed, because crowns are heavy, kingdoms are complicated, and governing millions of people turns out to be difficult enough without attempting it through the bottom of a wine goblet. For many rulers, that lesson arrived far too late. For historians, however, it left behind some unforgettable stories.